Hi, my name's Sean Millman. I recently completed a PhD in percussion performance from NYU. I'm currently the adjunct instructor of percussion for Missouri Southern State University and the incoming chair of the PAS Scholarly Research Committee. As you can see, this presentation is entitled Leveraging Deliberate Practice Science for Efficient Improvement, a Model to Get Better Faster. So I'm giving away the punchline early. This is my loop. This is a 5-part deliberate practice loop combining things from different fields. Now all I've done here is combine elements from 3 related but different research fields, and I've connected them where they overlap for a unified model of how to do deliberate practice. I'll define each of these as we get to them. Real quick, you will see in this presentation a lot of references from sports and athletics. The reason for that is that much of this science lives in that realm, and a lot of that is because it's easier to get good data in sports. It's easier to kind of make things binary and determine, was that good or bad? Did the ball go in the basket or did it not? Whereas in music, that's much more subjective, and it's harder to determine if something was success or a failure. Now, my hope for this model is that it functions to bring together these various ideas from separate disciplines into a single unified construct that can help guide our practice and guide our application of peak performance strategies to help musicians train more effectively. So these are the 3 fields from which my research draws: expert performance, motor learning, and sports psychology. Quick hit, one-shot overview of what these are. Expert performance seeks to answer the question, what makes Yo-Yo Ma Yo-Yo Ma? What makes LeBron LeBron? What explains expert performers and their expertise being so much better than the vast majority of people operating in their domain? Motor learning is the study of how we encode what is commonly called muscle memory. Now, muscle memory is a bit of a problematic term. Hopefully we all understand that our muscles don't actually remember anything. What's happening there is our brain has encoded sets of signals that it sends in order to make our bodies do something effectively. And then sports psychology is about how do I achieve my current potential in the moment. These are generalizations, what I'm about to make right now, but you can kind of think of these 3 fields in decreasing level of size. So expert performance looks at things on the level of years and decades. How do we craft a life that is conducive to creating an expert level of performance? Yes, that discourse absolutely deals with how do we practice and all of that sort of thing, but for these purposes, you can think of it as long-term, how do we craft a life of deliberate practice. Motor learning is a little smaller, on the order of like weeks, months, and years. How do we encode a skill? How do we train our bodies to do something physical better than they currently do? And then sports psychology is about the moment, whether it's a practice rep or a performance, is about how do I perform as best I possibly can in the moment when it counts. So if we're going to talk about expert performance, we have to talk about this man. This is the late K. Anders Ericsson. He's kind of the founder of deliberate practice and the expert performance discourse. The study in the citation on the right there is his 1993 study of violinists in Berlin that found, spoiler alert, the ones who had practiced more over the course of their lives were better players. This study is where we get the term deliberate practice, which refers only to activities specifically designed to cause improvement. This study is also the foundation for the so-called 10,000 hour rule, which was a misunderstanding and a misapplication of Ericsson's work and the work of his co-authors. Music and sports are the 2 primary fields researched in the expert performance discourse. There are others, but the 2 big ones are music and sports. So let's start talking about the elements of the loop. So the first one here is motivation. Now, obviously, motivation has this connotation of desire and wanting to engage in the activity. That's not what we're talking about here. This process is effective. This process I'm presenting here is effective for doing the work once that decision has been made. I'm not here to get people to want to do the work. But this desire-based motivation is kind of the keys to the engine that makes the whole thing go. Without that, obviously, nothing else works. What this element is primarily about here are physiological factors that affect how well we encode that motor learning. So enhanced expectancies, what is that? It's functionally just confidence based on past performance. Confidence based on past performance. It's what we expect will happen when we begin a repetition of a skill. And then autonomy is ownership and agency simply through choice. And the research actually has demonstrated that that choice doesn't even need to be consequential to the task at hand. We just need some kind of choice. So these two scholars, we have Gabrielle Wolf on the left and Rebecca Luthwaite on the right. In 2016, they proposed what's called the optimal theory of motor learning, which was kind of, they recognized that the existing overarching theories in the motor learning discourse were outdated. And then they posited this theory to kind of fill that gap and modernize things. And in the 5 years since, it largely has kind of held water and worked out as, yeah, this is correct. So the optimal theory is where we get autonomy and enhanced expectancies from. Now the next slide comes from that optimal theory publication with one thing missing. I've taken something out, and then the slide afterward I'll bring it back and demonstrate that, and you'll see what's going on there. Okay, so this is the diagram of the optimal theory and how it works. We want to be reading this left to right, kind of like a math problem, that the things on the left are the variables and then the things on the right are the solution. So what we want is for motor learning, our mental encoding of which signals our brains should be sending to our body, again, colloquially and kind of erroneously called muscle memory, to improve so that we're better at the skill. Which signals do we send so that we're better at the skill? How do we encode that into our minds? And then everything else on this board is a variable on the equation affecting that. Hopefully many of us have heard the kind of counter cliche statement that practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent, which is an allusion to our brains writing those new pathways and strengthening them each time we do something. And the more times we do something correctly, the stronger that path is. Hence, when motor performance improves, motor learning improves. And you can see that off to the right there. So let's talk about this again, left to right. So there's those two motivational elements up there, autonomy and enhanced expectancies, and then those lean into enhance the performer's focus on the task goal. You see that up arrow there in the middle of the screen? That functionally means that when the performer is focused on the task goal, we get better. And you see that down arrow there next to self-focus. That functionally means that when the performer is focused on themselves or their own body or something that is increasing anxiety, that makes us worse. And then through more effective focus on the task goal, we increase our motor performance, and then that then increases motor learning. What's the difference between motor performance and motor learning? Motor performance is just one example, one rep of a couple of paradiddles or an entire, Beethoven symphony or whatever it is. Motor performance is one thing, and then motor learning is our improvement over time as we improve, as we increase the fidelity of that encoding of muscle memory. As we improve, we learn this motor skill, and motor learning is that long-term view. Motor performance is one object of it. I mentioned that I had taken something out of this graphic. I'm about to bring it back, and boom, there it is. So we've got this line here. What is that line? As motor performance gets better, there's a line that brings us all the way back around to enhanced expectancies. Like I mentioned, enhanced expectancies is functionally confidence based on previous performance. So as our motor performance gets better than it used to be, then our expectation of what will happen the next time we act improves because we're expecting it to be better based on we just saw ourselves get better. Okay, so moving on to the mental representation. Now, mental representation is an Erickson term. It refers to essentially what our mind's eye and ear hold as the model of how we'd like to, in our case as percussionists, how we'd like to play, how we'd like to sound. It's an internal videotape of how we would like to play if we could execute precisely as we wish to. The way I kind of define it with my students and in my research is it's a combination of memory and imagination that represents the highest possible level of performance of which an individual can currently conceive. A combination of memory and imagination that represents the highest possible level of performance of which an individual can currently conceive. Again, the other way you can think about this is this mental videotape, right? Okay, so now I want to talk about the PETLEP model of motor learning. The diagram you're looking at here is not actually from the study itself. It's from the lower citation there. I just think it's a clearer diagram to explain than the one that's in the original publication. So the original publication, 2001, Holmes and Collins, it's the upper citation there, the PETLEP model of motor imagery. So what does PETLEP stand for? These 7 things on your screen there: physical, environment, task, timing, learning, emotion, and perspective. What are those? The authors are sports psychologists who've put this out to say, we know in sports psychology that visualization is valuable and that it works and that it makes us better. These are the 7 things that these 2 authors put forward and said, for effective visualization, each of these 7 things need to be accounted for. So what are they? Let's go through them really quick. Physical, what is the body doing? Are we standing? Are we sitting? What kind of instrument are we standing behind? What are we holding? Environment, where is this happening, right? Are we imaging ourselves in a practice room? Are we imaging ourselves on stage behind a screen at an orchestral audition? Are we, on stage at a senior recital? Are we on stage at, Carnegie Hall? Is it, the drum and bugle corps competition field? Is it, a Power 5 conference football field with 90,000 fans? That kind of thing. Where are we? Task, what are we doing? What music is being played? Timing. Now, a lot of stuff in my model is actually domain general and can be applied outside of music. Obviously, timing has a particular relevance to musicians, and obviously for us as drummers and percussionists, it has an even more particular relevance for us. So I suggest that as we're creating these visualizations, these mental representations, this mental model combination of memory and imagination, it is valuable for us to create one both at performance tempo and at the current tempo that we're practicing at. So let's say I'm working on a piece at quarter note equals 110, but I'm currently practicing it at quarter note equals 85. There is value in creating my visualization, my mental representation at both the performance tempo and the practice tempo so that I have both of these models. Learning, again, this is improvement over time. All this means in the context of the PETLEP model and the mental representation is that as we get better and as we are able to perceive higher levels of performance, we are updating the mental representation and kind of giving that mental videotape higher definition, higher fidelity as we go. Emotion, there's 2 elements here. So one is what are the emotions that we want the audience to take away from? What do we want the audience to feel during this performance? And then the other side is what do we as the performer feel during this performance? I think we as performers are relatively acquainted with the fact that those aren't always the same thing, that maybe I want the audience to feel one thing, but what I'm feeling and what I'm focusing on and what my internal monologue is during this performance, assuming I don't have mental quiet, which would be ideal, is can be different than what I'm trying to encode for the audience. And then perspective, this is about first or third person visualization. The PETLEP authors write that essentially they hold that it should be first-person visualization is better. I suggest that for our purposes as musicians and as drummers and percussionists, first and third are both valuable for various reasons. For example, let's say you're working on a video recording of something that the performance is going up on social media or something like that, and the video element is part of the performance. Having a mental representation from that third person, from that camera angle, is going to be really valuable for practicing toward the ideal performance. Okay, so pre-performance routines. What is a pre-performance routine? Well, it's a routine that is done in the last few seconds before a performance. Maybe the easiest example that most people will be familiar with is the concept of free throw shooters in basketball, right? Basketball players famously commonly have these routines that they go through when they get to the foul line before they take a foul shot. So The big name that I'm going to reference here in sports psychology is Don Green. I think a lot of musicians are familiar with his work. Was a U.S. Army Green Beret, then got into sports psychology, worked with athletes, has worked with tons of Olympians, and for many years now has also worked with orchestral musicians and realized the things that he was doing with athletes work the same for musicians. They just needed to be tailored a little bit. So one of Green's big concepts, and he's not the only one to have this. There's also research literature that backs this up, is this idea of a cue word or a process cue within a pre-performance routine. And this is a word or phrase that's designed to load the mental representation into the player's mind. Now, to my knowledge, Green doesn't use the term mental representation, but what he's talking about is loading that mental idea into the player's mind in the last few seconds before execution so that we're aiming for the highest ideal performance that we can imagine or that we can conceive of. Now for Green, these cue words should be a simple and general statement of the ideal. So examples would be something like pure, dark, martial, tragic, triumphant, not something technical like don't go sharp or breath support. The reason for that is if, in the last few seconds before execution, we're thinking, make sure my left-hand stick angle is correct or something like that, then all of a sudden we're focusing on a very small element of mechanics instead of this generalized statement of the ideal. Green's full pre-performance process is something called centering, which is this 3-breath process. The first one, we're just the performer in Green's model is supposed to focus just on breathing itself. The second one, the performer is supposed to focus on their center of gravity. And then the third one uses the cue word, again, to load the mental representation in right before execution. And the idea here is to kind of let the arrow of the performance fly instead of overthinking things and trying to walk the arrow to its target, right? Now, this is a connection to the optimal theory of focusing on the task instead of ourselves. That's Dr. Green. That's one of his books. Now, one of the other keys about pre-performance routines and how they work and why they're so valuable is we know that when we're accessing a motor skill from our brains, we know that it functions better if we can pull it from short-term memory than from long-term memory. This is why in many cases our second repetition of something is better than our first. And one benefit of a pre-performance routine is moving that skill into short-term memory, and a task-relevant motion can help with that. So at this point I want to talk a little bit about Steve Nash. The basketball fans in the audience know who he is almost certainly. He's currently a coach in the NBA. Before that, he was an all-time great NBA player. Currently has the highest free throw percentage, the highest career free throw percentage in NBA history, except for Steph Curry, who is still an active player, so we don't know what his career percentage is going to be. Nash's pre-performance routine before foul shots was to take his shot as perfectly as he could, with every motion being pristine, without the ball, before the ref gave him the ball. It's important to realize here some background. NBA players in general have about a 5% better percentage on the second free throw shot than the first one. Why might that be? Well, the first free throw shot is coming from long-term memory because it hasn't been accessed in a while. And then the second, because we just took the first very recently, the second shot is accessing short-term memory, which again we know is better. So Nash's pre-performance routine of miming his entire shot as perfectly as he could just without the ball was functionally moving the skill into short-term memory. And Nash had a much smaller difference between his first and second free throws. I think it was something on the order of a 1% difference. Again, the average NBA player is something on the order of 5%. Now, think about this for musicians, right? How often do we get a second rep at something, right? Certainly in the orchestral audition scenario, maybe you might, but in live performance, how often do we get a second shot at something? So being able to leverage this science to give us a better shot of an effective execution in the first time is obviously very valuable for us. Okay, so these next two elements here I'm going to talk about at the same time, both because they're interrelated and also for time for the purposes of this presentation. So well, let me talk about feedback first. So feedback needs to come from three sources: self, peer, and coach there, right? So self is something like recording ourselves, right? But even without that is just playing through something and then asking yourself, how did that go? There's a lot of data missing in that because our brains get in our own ways and we can bias ourselves saying, oh, things went way better than they actually did. Self-recording allows us to be more objective about that. And then peer, this is mock auditions or just grabbing a friend and pulling them in a practice room and saying, hey, listen to me play this. And then coach feedback is lessons, right? So the idea here is if we use the first two right, self and peer, then our lessons will be far more efficient with less diagnosis and more prescription. Less of our teacher saying, hey, this is what's going on, and more of us going into our lesson and saying, hey, I already know this is what's going on. Are you hearing this? And what do we do about it, right? Less diagnosis, more prescription, more information transfer from teacher to student. And then prioritization there. This is the thing that's the most domain specific, that's the most kind of tailored to which piece and which style we're working in. And all prioritization is once we have this feedback, we determine what to do with it and what to practice and how to structure our practice sessions. Okay, so this is Jason Haheim. He's one of my teachers. He's one of the two principal timpanists of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. And he's here largely for his ideas about feedback. And the next slide here is one of his. I do have his permission to use it. He also would give credit to John Tafoya, who was one of his teachers, who's the professor of percussion at Indiana University. So what this is a pyramid of priorities, right? And it's built on top of this three-legged stool idea. You see at the bottom, now this is built for orchestral timpani auditions. You see at the bottom here, time, intonation, rhythmic integrity, right? What's the idea of a three-legged stool? If you knock one of the legs out, the whole thing falls over. And the idea of this hierarchy here is that, if we're playing out of time, for example, then none of the things that are higher up on this hierarchy matter. If you look at the top end of this pyramid, things like X factor, energy, confidence, owning the chair. These are obviously very important things to a musical performance, but if you're playing the wrong notes or your perfect fourth is actually a tritone, those things don't matter. It doesn't matter how much you own the chair if you're playing things just objectively wrong. So this hierarchy here is a way to help us order what we're getting in feedback and determine which things are the most important. If I have a time problem, that's priority one. Okay, all of my time, rhythm, and intonation is okay. Let me move up one other level. Let me move up one other level. The specific things that are in different places on this model can change between various applications, right? So, for example, a marimba player working on reflections on the nature of water is not really concerned about intonation. Obviously, we can't tune the marimba, but we might swap that brick of the three-legged stool out for accuracy, right? And then as you go up here, all of these things can be swapped out for whichever specific application we're in. But the idea of a hierarchy holds true across, I would say, every musical application. Okay, so here's the whole loop again, and what I want to do now is get into an example application here. And let me just check through my notes here. Okay. So for this audience, I assume there will be going to be many of us who are familiar with this excerpt. For those who aren't, this is the timpani excerpt to the coda of Movement 1 of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, one of the most often asked excerpts in the entire orchestral timpani rep. So I'm going to go through an example round of this loop for a hypothetical player who was on the orchestral audition trail. So we're taking this excerpt and we're starting at motivation, right? And again, we start at that desire level of I want to do this, right? Well, if this player is taking orchestral auditions, this excerpt is definitely going to be on some lists. There's the desire motivation right there. I would like to win a job. I need to be able to play this well in order to do that. Boom, there's the desire. Okay. Enhanced expectancies and autonomy, we'll get to that when we come back around the loop. All right, so the mental representation. As we start our way around this loop, the player should be creating a, again, combination of memory and imagination, this mental videotape that is their visualized version of the best possible performance that they can imagine themselves giving. Right, so let's talk about a specific element here. So right at letter S, there are these 8 bars of 9 30-second notes, or 8 30-second notes and an eighth note. Right, this digga-digga-digga-digga-dum, digga-digga-digga-digga-dum phrase that is theoretically very simple, but you know, the timpanists among us know that they're very hard to play evenly. So this is a very kind of obvious, significant indicator within this excerpt. If we're playing those well, we sound good, and if we're playing those badly, we sound bad. It's very simple. It's very hard, but it's very simple. So we've figured out that playing these evenly is a target. It's something important that we want to be able to focus on. Okay, now here's our mental representation. We go in there and we imagine it being even. Great, we visualize that being even. Then we go to a pre-performance routine. We need to build a cue word for this. Okay, so again, we want that cue word to be a general statement of the ideal. So the word even works out. So before a rep of playing, you know, maybe it's just the 8 bars at S, or maybe it's, you know, a rep of the entire excerpt. Before that, we might say the word even in our heads just to get that idea in our minds of that ideal performance. And then we go through and play it, and by the time we've gotten to S, that idea is in our head of what we're aiming for. Then we get some feedback on our performance, whether it's watching a self-recording, asking our friend what they thought after a mock audition, or going into a lesson. And let's say that this player hears that these 30-second note passages at S are rhythmically correct, but are not even from a volume and timbre and tone perspective, right? And then let's say that player goes into their lesson and they say, hey, it sounds like this is in time, but it's not consistent in terms of timbre. Is that what you're hearing? And then let's say the teacher says, yes, that is what I'm hearing, and here's why. That teacher might recognize that the player's left hand, as they're playing those, is higher than the right hand, which, as we know, is going to cause different stick angles and is going to cause a different angle of attack for the mallet head to the timpani head, and boom, there's your timbre difference, right? Well, now we got into prioritization. We have a priority. We have a target to focus on of something to fix. We need to fix this. Okay, so now we have something that we can use to target our practice and build exercises around it and to focus on, right? So now we come back around to the top of the loop here, to motivation. So what's happening there is through a round of deliberate practice, this player's expectancies are enhanced. They have greater confidence because they've seen themselves improve over the course of the last however long they've been practicing this and recording themselves playing mocks, taking lessons. And they have a greater sense of autonomy because through the feedback and prioritization process, this player knows, if I can fix my left-hand stick angle, which is because my wrist is too high, then I will be able to play this better and my sound will be more even. That's control over the outcome of the performance through greater knowledge here. The mental representation. We talked about the learning element of the PETLEP model of motor learning, being that we improve the representation over time. Well, you know, again, the mental representation, memory, and imagination. We can use the memory element of these self-recordings to base things off of, and then we use the imagination to visualize a version of this where the hands are in the correct position, so that that's the ideal in our head. And then we get to pre-performance routine, and now we're loading that ideal into our head. It's the correct ideal, so it's easier for us to match up what's happening in the real world to what's happening in our heads. And the other thing that might happen here is we might update the cue word, right? So before, the cue word was even. Well, now, let's say we don't have a performance or an audition coming up in a while, and we have some time, and we'll have some time to update the cue word again. Well, at this point, we might make the cue word low left hand, which again is too specific, so we wouldn't want that in an actual audition or performance scenario. But over the course of maybe a week or a few days, if that's the target, that might work if that's the only thing we're focused on. And then we get back to a larger performance mindset, and we're going to shift back to a word like even, or maybe some other word that might better encapsulate the totality of that performance that we're trying to create. Then we go over to feedback. Now the key with feedback here is, since we know that this difference in angle between our two hands is what we want to focus on at the moment, that's our current priority and target, that's going to inform how we get feedback. We might choose a better camera angle for our recording to be able to see what's going on better, to be able to have a better shot at where's my wrist. Are the two sticks going straight up and down? Are they hitting the head in the same spot? That sort of thing. Now that we know what we're looking for, we can get feedback on it in a more informed way. We can go to our mock auditions and ask them, hey, listen to S and tell me what you hear there. Is this even? Is this not? And then after all of that process, we go back into our lesson. Hopefully the problem has fixed itself and we can go to our teacher and say, this seems better. Does it sound better to you? And then the teacher might say yes. Okay, let's move on, or no, we need to keep going around this thing on this one target right here. And then let's say that things are going well. We've fixed the wrist height problem, and now the 30-second notes at letter S are even. Boom, we go back into prioritization, and we find the next priority here. Now, the idea here is that we keep going around this process, drilling down deeper to that bedrock of a perfect performance that we obviously know we can't reach, but we can get closer to. Now, there are a ton more details here, but that's all I've got time for. Again, my name is Sean Millman, and I appreciate your time.